The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road that led away from Red Valley, painting everything in shades of gold and desperation. The year was 1873, and the frontier was still wild enough to swallow whole families without leaving so much as a gravestone to mark their passing. On this particular morning, as the heat rose in shimmering waves from the cracked earth, a rickety wagon creaked its way down that same road, loaded not with hope or household goods, but with the bitter weight of abandonment. Inside the wagon sat two figures who had long ago traded their humanity for the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Frank and Margaret Cole had once been respectable people, or so the faded daguerreotype in Margaret's pocket suggested. But years of failed crops, gambling debts, and the crushing weight of feeding 7 mouths had carved them into something harder, something colder, something that could look at their own children and see only burdens to be cast off. Behind them, stumbling through the dust kicked up by the wagon wheels, 7 children followed like a funeral procession. The oldest, Eliza, barely 19 but already carrying the weight of motherhood in her thin shoulders, kept her arms wrapped protectively around the youngest ones. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face that had learned too early that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Tommy, 15 and trying so hard to be the man his father never was, walked with clenched fists and a jaw set against the pain of understanding exactly what was happening. Mary, 13, clutched little Danny's hand while Beth and Lucy pressed close to Eliza's side, their wide eyes reflecting a confusion that would soon turn to devastating clarity. And then there was baby Rose, just 3 years old, riding on Eliza's hip, her tiny fingers tangled in her sister's worn shawl, blissfully unaware that this dusty road was leading to the end of everything she had ever known. The wagon creaked to a stop beside a weathered fence post that marked the edge of nowhere. Frank climbed down first, his boots hitting the dirt with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Margaret followed, her movements sharp and brittle, like a woman made of glass who had been shattered too many times to ever be whole again. "This is far enough," Frank announced, his voice carrying the hollow authority of a man who had convinced himself that cruelty was just another form of practicality. "You young'uns can make your own way from here." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how such words could exist in a world that still pretended to believe in love. Eliza stepped forward, baby Rose still clinging to her hip, her voice steady despite the tremor that ran through her hands. "Pa, you can't mean... Don't you pa me," Frank snarled, his face twisting with something that might have been guilt if he'd had enough soul left to feel it. "You're old enough to work, old enough to tend to the little ones. We gave you life, and that's more than we owed you." Margaret stood beside the wagon, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon, as if by not looking at her children, she could pretend they had never existed at all. "Should have stopped it too," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Should have known better than to keep bringing mouths into a world that don't want to feed them." Little Lucy began to cry then, a soft, broken sound that seemed to tear something fundamental in the fabric of the morning. Danny pressed closer to Mary's side, while Beth reached for Eliza's free hand with desperate fingers. Tommy's voice cracked as he spoke, the boy in him finally breaking through the man he'd been trying so hard to become. "Ma, please, we'll work harder. We won't eat so much. We promise we'll..." "Promises don't fill bellies or pay debts," Frank cut him off, already turning back toward the wagon. "You're smart kids. You'll figure something out." And with that casual dismissal of 7 lives, Frank and Margaret Cole climbed back into their wagon and drove away, leaving nothing behind but dust and the echoes of promises they had made 19 years ago when they'd held their first child and sworn to love her always. The children stood in the road long after the wagon had disappeared, long after the dust had settled, long after hope should have died. But it didn't die, not completely, because sometimes in the darkest moments, when everything else has been stripped away, what remains isn't despair. Sometimes what remains is something much more dangerous. Sometimes what remains is determination. And Eliza Cole, standing in that dusty road with 6 pairs of eyes looking to her for salvation, felt that determination settle into her bones like molten steel. She didn't know how she would feed them, shelter them, or keep them safe. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would survive this, all of them, together. The sun hadn't moved more than a finger's width across the sky when the reality of their situation began to sink in like poison into a wound. The wagon was gone. Their parents were gone, and 7 children stood alone on a road that seemed to stretch into eternity in both directions. Baby Rose had stopped crying and now rested her head against Eliza's shoulder with the trusting weight of someone who believed her big sister could fix anything. If only she knew how desperately Eliza wished that were true. "What do we do now?" Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Eliza looked down the road they had traveled, then back toward Red Valley, calculating distances and possibilities with the grim efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that survival required planning, not wishing. "We go back," she said finally, shifting Rose to her other hip. "There's nothing for us out here, but at least in town there might be work, people who'll pay a penny for chores." "But the house," Beth started. "Is sold," Tommy finished bitterly. "Pa made sure of that before they left, probably drinking away the money right now. The house had been their shelter, their sanctuary, the only constant in a childhood marked by their father's failures and their mother's increasing bitterness. It was a small, weathered structure that had seen better days, but it had been theirs. The kitchen where Eliza had learned to stretch a handful of beans into soup for 7. The bedroom where she had sung lullabies to babies who cried from hunger. The porch where she had sat on countless evenings, watching the road and hoping that tomorrow would bring something better than today. Now it belonged to someone else, and they belonged to no one. The walk back to Red Valley took 3 hours. 3 hours of dust and heat and the terrible weight of Rose growing heavier with each step. 3 hours of watching the younger children's faces grow paler, their steps more uncertain. 3 hours of Tommy walking beside her, his young face set in lines too hard for his age, as if he were trying to absorb some of the burden through sheer will. They reached the outskirts of town as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful if any of them had the luxury of noticing beauty anymore. Red Valley wasn't much of a town, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, like settlers gathering around a campfire for protection against the dark. But it was civilization, and civilization meant possibility. The first place they stopped was the general store, its windows dusty and fly-specked, displaying goods that might as well have been treasures from a fairy tale for all the chance these children had of affording them. Mr. Patterson, the store owner, looked up from his ledger as the bell above the door announced their arrival. His eyes took in the 7 children, travel-stained, exhausted, clearly alone, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to uncomfortable recognition. "Eliza Cole," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Heard your folks headed out this morning. Figured you young'uns went with them." "They did head out," Eliza replied, her chin lifted with a pride that refused to acknowledge shame. "We stayed." Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. He was a businessman, not a fool, and the implications of 7 children staying while their parents headed out were clear enough. "I see," he said slowly. "And what brings you to my store?" "Work," Eliza said simply. "I can sweep floors, organize stock, keep books if you need. The older ones can lift and carry. We're not asking for charity, Mr. Patterson, just a chance to earn our keep." For a moment, something like sympathy flickered across the store owner's face. But sympathy didn't pay rent or put food on shelves, and Patterson had his own family to think about. "I'm sorry, Eliza," he said, and he did sound genuinely sorry. "But I barely make enough to keep this place running as it is. I can't afford to take on help, especially not—" He gestured vaguely at the crowd of children filling his small store. "Especially not 7 of us," Eliza finished for him, her voice steady despite the disappointment that settled like a stone in her chest. They tried the saloon next, where the owner laughed at the very suggestion of hiring children. Then the blacksmith, who looked at Tommy with something like interest before shaking his head and muttering about liability. The bakery, the livery stable, even the church, each door that closed felt like another nail in a coffin they couldn't afford to build. As the sun set and the shadows grew long, the 7 cold children found themselves standing in the town square, surrounded by the warm glow of lamplight spilling from windows that might as well have belonged to another world. "I'm hungry," Lucy whispered. her small hand tugging at Eliza's skirt. "I know, sweetheart," Eliza murmured, though her own stomach had been gnawing at itself for hours. "We'll find something." But as she looked around at the town settling into its evening routine, families gathering around dinner tables, children being tucked into warm beds, the comfortable rituals of people who belong somewhere, she wondered if she was making promises she couldn't keep. Tommy appeared at her elbow, his voice low so the younger ones couldn't hear. "Liza, there's talk about the old Hendricks place on the edge of town. Been empty since the fever took them last winter. Might be we could—" He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. The Hendricks place. She remembered it, a small cabin that had been home to an elderly couple until influenza claimed them both in the space of a week. It had stood empty since then, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. "Show me," she said quietly. The cabin sat on a small rise about a quarter-mile from the last real house in Red Valley, surrounded by scrub brush and the kind of desolate beauty that the frontier specialized in. The roof sagged in places, and several of the windows were broken, but the structure looked sound enough. More importantly, it was empty. They pushed through the door as the last light faded from the sky, baby Rose whimpering softly in Eliza's arms. The interior was thick with dust and the smell of abandonment, but it was dry and it was theirs, at least for tonight. "Tommy, see if you can find some wood for a fire," Eliza said, her voice taking on the tone of authority that had become second nature over the years of caring for her siblings. "Mary, help me clear a space where we can sleep. Beth, Lucy, look around and see if there's anything useful left behind." As her siblings scattered to their tasks, Eliza stood in the center of the small room, Rose heavy in her arms, and tried to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She was 19 years old, alone, responsible for 6 lives, and she had exactly nothing to her name except the clothes on their backs and a determination that felt fragile as spun glass. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the walls and reminding her that winter would come, sooner or later. Winter always came, but tonight they had shelter. Tonight they were together. Tonight they were alive. And sometimes on the frontier, that was enough to call it a victory. As Tommy coaxed a small fire to life in the old stone hearth, and the children gathered around its meager warmth, Eliza made a silent promise to the empty room and the vast Texas sky beyond its broken windows. They would survive this, all of them. She would make sure of it, even if she had to burn herself down to ash to keep them warm. The first week in the abandoned Hendricks cabin tested every ounce of strength Eliza had ever possessed and demanded reserves she didn't know existed. Each morning brought new challenges that seemed designed to break her spirit, and each evening found her wondering how many more days she could hold herself together before the weight of 7 lives finally crushed her completely. Food was the most immediate concern. The small amount of bread and jerky they had managed to gather from the cabin's meager supplies lasted exactly 2 days. After that, Eliza found herself doing things she had never imagined, digging through the refuse behind the general store for scraps that might still be edible, teaching Lucy and Danny to identify which berries growing wild on the outskirts of town were safe to eat, and swallowing her pride to knock on back doors and beg for work that paid in meals rather than money. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, took pity on them twice and allowed Eliza to wash dishes in exchange for leftover stew. The saloon owner, despite his earlier refusal to hire them, occasionally let Tommy sweep out the place in the early morning hours for a few coins and whatever food hadn't been consumed the night before. But it wasn't nearly enough. 7 growing bodies needed more than scraps and charity, and Eliza could see the effects of their meager diet in the hollowing of Beth's cheeks, the way Danny's clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame, and most heartbreaking of all, how baby Rose had grown quiet and listless, no longer babbling or reaching for the things that used to delight her. The nights were the hardest. They had found a few old blankets in the cabin, moldy and thin, but better than nothing. Still, when the temperature dropped and the wind found every crack in the walls, they huddled together like puppies, sharing warmth and trying to pretend that the shivers that racked their bodies were just temporary discomfort rather than the first warnings of something more serious. It was during one of these cold nights, when Rose's breathing had taken on a whistling quality that made Eliza's chest tight with fear, that she made a decision that would have horrified her parents, if they had been there to be horrified. She began to steal, not from the people of Red Valley who had shown them what kindness they could afford, but from the land itself, from the cattle that grazed on the open range, from the chicken coops of farms on the outskirts of town, from anywhere she could take what they needed without causing direct harm to families who were only marginally better off than they were. Tommy was her accomplice, though she tried to keep the younger children from knowing exactly where their sudden improvement in meals was coming from. Together they would slip out after midnight, moving like shadows across the moonlit landscape, taking an egg here, a handful of grain there, occasionally managing to catch a chicken that had wandered too far from its coop. It wasn't enough to truly fill their bellies, but it was enough to keep the worst of the hunger at bay. More importantly, it was enough to bring some color back to Rose's cheeks and restore the spark to Danny's eyes. But survival required more than food. It required hope. And hope, Eliza was learning, was the most fragile thing of all. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in their second week at the cabin. Eliza had risen before dawn, as had become her habit, to check on each of her sleeping siblings and plan the day's strategy for finding food and work. She was kneeling beside Rose's makeshift bed, checking to make sure the baby's breathing was still clear, when she heard voices outside. Adult voices, official voices. Her blood turned to ice water as she recognized the tone, if not the words. It was the sound of authority, of people who had the power to make decisions about other people's lives. She crept to the broken window and peered through a gap in the boards they had nailed up for privacy. 3 men stood outside the cabin, and even in the dim morning light she could see the glint of a badge on one man's vest. The sheriff. With him were 2 other men she didn't recognize, but their clean clothes and well-fed faces marked them as people of standing in the community. "Squatters," one of them was saying, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Can't have it. Sets a bad precedent." "Now, Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff replied, his tone suggesting this was an argument they'd had before. "They're just children. Where exactly do you propose they go?" "Not my concern," Caldwell replied coldly. "This is private property, and they have no right to be here. I want them gone by sundown, or I'll have them arrested for trespassing." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed the implications. Caldwell, she remembered the name now. He was some sort of land speculator, buying up properties around Red Valley. Apparently, he had purchased the Hendricks place and had plans for it that didn't include housing 7 orphan children. She turned from the window to find Tommy standing behind her, his face pale but determined. He had heard it too. "What do we do?" he whispered. Before she could answer, baby Rose stirred in her sleep and began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that sent panic shooting through Eliza's chest. Rose had been fighting a cold for days, and in the damp, poorly heated cabin, it was getting worse instead of better. The sound of the cough carried outside, and the conversation stopped abruptly. "There are children in there," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a different quality. "I don't care if there's a whole orphanage in there," Caldwell snapped. "The law is the law. They have until sundown." Eliza heard their footsteps retreating, but she knew this wasn't over. In a few hours they would be back, probably with reinforcements, and 7 children would once again be cast onto the road with nowhere to go. She looked around the cabin that had become their sanctuary, taking in the careful improvements they had made. The corners they had swept clean, the broken window they had covered, the small pile of firewood Tommy had gathered and stacked neatly beside the hearth. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs. "Liza!" Mary's voice was small and frightened. She had awakened and heard enough to understand what was happening. "It's all right," Eliza said automatically, though nothing felt all right. "We'll figure something out. We always do." But even as she said the words, she wondered if this time was different, if this time their luck had finally run out. The day passed in a haze of desperate activity. Eliza sent Mary and Beth into town to try once more for work, any work, that might provide them with enough money to rent a room somewhere. Tommy took Danny and Lucy foraging, hoping to gather enough food to sustain them if they had to take to the road again. And Eliza sat in the cabin with baby Rose, rocking her as the child's cough grew worse and her fever climbed higher. Each labored breath felt like an accusation, a reminder that she was failing in the most basic responsibility she had taken on, keeping her family safe. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that mocked her despair, Eliza heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses? She didn't need to look outside to know that Sheriff Morrison had returned with help to enforce Caldwell's eviction. She gathered Rose closer to her chest and called softly to Tommy, who appeared immediately at her side. "Get the others," she said quietly. "It's time to go." But as they prepared to leave the only home they had known for 2 weeks, as they gathered their few possessions and prepared to face another night on the road with a sick baby and 5 exhausted children, Eliza found herself thinking not of defeat, but of defiance. They had survived this long against impossible odds. They had fed themselves when there was no food, sheltered themselves when there was no shelter, held together when everything else fell apart. And they would continue to survive, because that's what Cole children did. They endured. They adapted. They never ever gave up. Even when giving up seemed like the only rational choice left. As they stepped out of the cabin into the fading light, ready to face whatever came next, Eliza carried with her more than just her baby sister and her handful of possessions. She carried the unshakable conviction that somewhere out there, somehow, there was a place for them, a place where 7 children without a name could finally, truly belong. She just had to find it. Samuel Hayes had been riding the perimeter of his ranch for the better part of the morning, checking fence lines and counting cattle with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that attention to detail was the difference between prosperity and poverty on the frontier. At 34, he was old enough to know that the land gave nothing freely, and young enough to still believe that hard work could make up for most of what luck failed to provide. His ranch was modest by Texas standards, 2,000 acres of rolling grassland dotted with mesquite and live oak, a solid cabin he had built with his own hands, and a barn that housed the finest horses in Red Valley. It wasn't the empire his father had dreamed of when he first staked his claim, but it was honest work that provided honest living, and that was enough for Sam. Or it had been enough until this morning, when the wind carried something unexpected across his land. The sound of children's voices, high and sweet and completely out of place in the vast emptiness of the Texas range. Sam reined in his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Justice, and cocked his head to listen. There it was again. Definitely children, and they seemed to be coming from the direction of Willow Creek, where it curved around the rocky outcropping that marked the northern boundary of his property. Curiosity overcoming caution, Sam nudged Justice toward the sound, riding carefully through the mesquite scrub that grew thick near the water. What he found when he crested the small rise above the creek stopped him cold. 7 children sat beside the water in various states of exhaustion and distress. The oldest, a young woman really, knelt at the creek's edge, using her cupped hands to give water to a baby who coughed with each swallow. The others sat or lay nearby, their clothes dusty and worn, their faces bearing the hollow look of people who had been traveling hard and eating little. Sam had seen enough hardship in his 34 years to recognize it when it was sitting right in front of him. These children were in trouble, serious trouble, and they were on his land, which made them his responsibility whether he wanted that burden or not. He dismounted slowly, not wanting to startle them, and approached with his hands visible and empty. The oldest girl, she couldn't be more than 19, looked up at his approach, and Sam felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her eyes. They were dark brown, wide with exhaustion and weariness, but there was something else there too, something fierce and unbroken that spoke of strength he couldn't quite comprehend. "Morning," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Name's Samuel Hayes. This is my land you're resting on." The girl's chin came up a fraction, and Sam recognized the gesture of someone preparing to fight, even when they had no strength left for fighting. "We're not stealing anything," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Just needed water for the baby. We'll move on directly." Sam looked more closely at the baby in her arms, a little girl, maybe 3 years old, whose breathing was labored and whose cheeks were flushed with fever. The sight of a sick child hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories he had spent years trying to bury. "Child's ill," he observed, his voice gentle. She's fine, the girl replied quickly, though her arms tightened protectively around the baby. Just tired from traveling? Sam could have pointed out that the baby's rattling cough and glassy eyes suggested something more serious than fatigue, but he recognized the defensive lie of someone who had learned that admitting weakness was dangerous. Instead, he glanced at the other children, a boy of maybe 15 who was trying to look threatening despite his obvious exhaustion, three girls who seemed to range in age from 8 to 13, and another boy who couldn't be more than 9 or 10. Long way from anywhere to be traveling with young ones, Sam said carefully, especially with supplies running low. He had noticed the absence of horses, the lack of a wagon, the small bundle that seemed to contain everything they owned. These children hadn't just been traveling, they had been walking, carrying everything they possessed, for what looked like days. "We manage," the girl said, but there was something in her voice that suggested managing was becoming increasingly difficult. Sam studied her face, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way she positioned herself between him and the younger children. The protective instincts that had clearly been honed by necessity. She reminded him of something, a cornered wildcat maybe, beautiful and fierce, and dangerous if threatened. "I don't doubt you do," he said quietly. "Question is, how much longer can you manage with a sick baby and winter coming on?" At the mention of winter, something flickered across her expression. A brief moment when the mask slipped and he saw the fear underneath. It was late October, and the nights were already turning cold. A sick child sleeping rough in winter was a death sentence, and they all knew it. "We'll find work in the next town," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Next town's Millerville," Sam told her, 40 miles northeast. Might be generous calling it a town. It's more of a trading post and a saloon. Not much call for," he gestured vaguely at the 7 children. "Well, for families looking for work." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Sam watched as the girl's composure finally cracked slightly, her shoulders sagging under the weight of responsibility that no 19-year-old should have to carry. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated as if even that simple information was dangerous to give. "Eliza," she said finally. "Eliza Cole. These are my brothers and sisters." "Cole," Sam repeated, and something clicked in his memory. "You wouldn't be Frank Cole's children, would you?" The way Eliza's face shuddered told him everything he needed to know. Frank Cole was known throughout the county as a gambler and a drunk, the kind of man who would bet his last dollar on a 3-legged horse if he thought the odds were good enough. If these were Frank's children, then Sam could guess at least part of their story. "I see," he said, and left it at that. The baby coughed again, a sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest, and Sam made a decision that would change everything. "My ranch is about 2 miles south of here," he said, his voice matter of fact. "Got a cabin with a good fireplace, a well with clean water, and a pantry that's better stocked than most. Also got experience with sick children, if that matters." Eliza's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that baby needs warmth and proper food if she's going to get better," Sam said bluntly. "And I'm suggesting that 7 people walking the roads in late October is a good way to end up as 7 graves come spring." "We're not charity cases," Eliza said, her pride flaring like a struck match. "Good," Sam replied calmly, "because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work. Ranch needs tending, animals need feeding, cabin needs keeping. Always more work than one person can handle properly." It was a lie mostly. Sam had been managing his ranch just fine on his own for 3 years. But it was the kind of lie that preserved dignity while offering salvation, and he could see in Eliza's eyes that she understood the distinction. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, feeding stock." Older boy looked strong enough to help with the heavier chores. Others can earn their keep doing whatever needs doing. Sam watched as Eliza glanced around at her siblings, taking in their exhausted faces, their hollow cheeks, the way they all looked to her for guidance. The weight of 7 lives was crushing her, and they all knew it. "Temporary," she said finally, the word coming out like it was being forced from her throat. "Just until the baby's well and we can figure out what comes next." "Temporary," Sam agreed. though something in his chest suggested that temporary might not be quite as temporary as either of them imagined. He helped them gather their few possessions and lifted the baby from Eliza's arms, ignoring her protective protest. The child was burning with fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. He had seen pneumonia before, and he knew that without proper care, this little girl might not live to see another week. As they made their way toward his ranch, the baby cradled in his arms and 6 children following behind like a parade of refugees, Sam found himself wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. But when he looked down at the sick child in his arms, felt her small hand clutch weakly at his shirt, he knew that whatever complications this brought to his quiet, orderly life, he couldn't have made any other choice. Some things were more important than solitude. Some things were worth the risk of having your heart broken all over again. The Hayes Ranch house was nothing like what Eliza had expected. She had imagined something rough and temporary, the kind of bachelor quarters that existed purely for function, without any thought to comfort or beauty. Instead, Sam led them to a solid log cabin with real glass windows, a wraparound porch with hand-carved railings, and flower boxes that spoke of someone who cared about more than just survival. The interior was even more surprising. The main room was spacious and warm, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that Sam immediately began coaxing to life. The furniture was simple but well-made, clearly crafted by hand, with an attention to detail that suggested patience and skill. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that ranged from practical farming manuals to poetry collections, and the kitchen area boasted a real iron stove and cupboards stocked with enough food to feed a small army. But what struck Eliza most forcefully was how clean everything was. This wasn't the home of a man who had given up on life or fallen into the kind of despair that marked so many bachelors on the frontier. This was the home of someone who believed in taking care of things, in building something worth maintaining. "Put the baby in the bedroom," Sam said, gesturing toward a door off the main room. "It's warmer in there, and the bed's more comfortable than anything out here." Eliza hesitated, clutching Rose more tightly to her chest. The idea of putting her baby sister in a stranger's bed felt wrong somehow, too intimate, too much like an admission that they were no longer capable of caring for themselves. Sam seemed to understand her reluctance. "Clean sheets," he said quietly. "Changed them yesterday, and there's extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed." Still Eliza hesitated until Rose coughed again, a deep, rasping sound that sent ice through her veins. The baby needed warmth and comfort more than Eliza needed pride. The bedroom was simple but welcoming, with a large bed covered in quilts that looked hand-stitched and a window that faced east to catch the morning sun. Eliza settled Rose on the bed, surrounding her with pillows and covers, while Sam disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a cup of something that steamed and smelled of honey and herbs. "Willow bark tea," he explained, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Good for fever and chest complaints. My mother's recipe." He held the cup to Rose's lips, coaxing her to drink with a patience and gentleness that surprised Eliza. Most men she knew were awkward around children, treating them like small, unpredictable animals that might bite or break without warning. But Sam moved with the confidence of someone who had experience with sick children, his large hands steady and sure as he helped Rose sip the tea. "You have children of your own?" Eliza asked, though she had noticed no signs of a family in the house. Something flickered across Sam's face. Pain, maybe, or memory. "Had a sister," he said quietly. "Younger than this one. Lost her to pneumonia when she was 4. The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Eliza's chest ache in sympathy. She looked at this man who was caring for her sister with such tenderness and began to understand that his offer of help might be motivated by more than simple kindness. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Sam nodded once, then stood and handed her the cup. "Keep getting this into her, little bits at a time, and don't let her get too warm. Fever needs to break naturally, but she needs to stay comfortable." Over the next few days, a routine slowly developed that surprised Eliza with its ease and naturalness. Sam rose before dawn each morning to tend to his animals and check his property, leaving the house quiet and peaceful for the children to wake slowly. By the time he returned for breakfast, Eliza had usually managed to coax a simple meal from his well-stocked kitchen: eggs from his chickens, bacon from his smokehouse, bread baked from flour that seemed abundant enough that she didn't have to measure every grain. The younger children adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience that had always amazed Eliza. Danny and Lucy explored the barn and the surrounding pastures with the wonder of children who had never been allowed to run freely without fear of disturbing the neighbors. Mary and Beth took over the task of feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, a chore they approached with the seriousness of a sacred duty. Even Tommy, who had initially been suspicious of Sam's motives, began to relax as he was invited to help with the heavier ranch work. But it was Rose's gradual recovery that truly won Eliza's trust. Under Sam's patient care, and with access to proper food and warmth, the baby's cough began to ease. Her fever broke, and the frightening wheezing that had kept Eliza awake at night gradually disappeared. Within a week, Rose was sitting up and babbling again, reaching for shiny objects with the natural curiosity of a healthy child. "She's going to be fine," Sam said one evening, as they sat by the fire, Rose sleeping peacefully in Eliza's arms. "Strong constitution. Takes more than a chest cold to keep a cold down, I'd guess." It was the first time he had mentioned their family name since that day by the creek, and Eliza felt something twist in her stomach at the reminder of who they were and where they had come from. "You know about our father," she said. It wasn't a question. Sam poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "Know of him. Frank Cole's got a reputation that reaches most places whiskey is sold. And our mother? Don't know much about her beyond what folks say about her leaving with Frank." Sam glanced at her. "Don't much care either. What matters is who you are, not who birthed you." The simple acceptance in his voice nearly undid her. Eliza had spent so many years apologizing for her parents' failures, making excuses for their absence, carrying shame that belonged to other people. To have someone dismiss all of that as irrelevant felt like being offered absolution she hadn't known she needed. "Why are you helping us?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in her chest for days, finally forcing its way out. Sam was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose family," he said. "Maybe because this house is too quiet with just me in it. Maybe because I think those young ones deserve a chance to grow up somewhere safe." He looked at her directly then, his eyes serious. "Maybe because watching you fight for them reminds me that there's still good things worth fighting for in this world." The intensity of his gaze made her uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange fluttering in her chest that she had been trying to ignore for days. Sam Hayes was a good man. She could see that clearly now. But more than that, he was a man who looked at her like she was worth something, like her struggles mattered, like she was more than just a burden to be endured. It was a dangerous way to feel about someone who was only offering temporary shelter. "This can't last forever," she said, as much to remind herself as to remind him. "We can't just live off your charity indefinitely." "Not charity," Sam corrected firmly. "You've been earning your keep since the day you got here. House has never been cleaner, meals have never been better, and Tommy's been more help than I expected. You're not taking from me, Eliza. You're adding to what's here." But even as his words warmed something deep in her chest, Eliza knew that the practical realities couldn't be ignored forever. 7 people couldn't simply disappear into one man's ranch without someone eventually noticing. Questions would be asked, authorities might become involved, and then what would happen to the children who had finally found safety? As if summoned by her worries, those practical realities arrived 3 days later in the form of Sheriff Morrison and 2 men Eliza didn't recognize. She saw them riding up the lane toward the house while she was hanging laundry, and her blood immediately turned to ice water. "Sam!" she called, her voice sharp with panic. He emerged from the barn where he had been working with Tommy, took one look at the approaching riders, and his face went carefully neutral. "Take the children inside," he said quietly. "All of them. Stay there until I come get you." "Sam, go, Eliza. Trust me." She gathered the children quickly, herding them into the house like a mother hen protecting her chicks. From the kitchen window, she watched as Sam walked out to meet the riders, his movements casual and unhurried, despite the tension she could see in the set of his shoulders. The conversation was too quiet for her to hear, but she could read the body language clearly enough. The sheriff was asking questions, gesturing toward the house. One of the other men was clearly agitated, pointing and making sharp gestures that spoke of anger and authority. Sam stood calmly in the center of it all, his hands relaxed at his sides, answering questions with the patience of someone who had nothing to hide. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the three men mounted their horses and rode away. Sam stood watching them until they disappeared down the lane, then turned and walked back toward the house. "What did they want?" Eliza asked the moment he walked through the door. "Caldwell's been asking questions about squatters on his property," Sam said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Sheriff mentioned he'd heard rumors about children being seen around my place." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I hired some help for the winter. Told them it was nobody's business but mine, who I choose to employ." Sam's eyes met hers. "Told them anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with me directly." The quiet strength in his voice, the way he had stood between them and potential danger without hesitation, made something shift permanently in Eliza's chest. This wasn't just temporary kindness anymore. This was protection. This was someone willing to stand up to authority on their behalf, someone willing to risk his own reputation and standing in the community for 7 children who weren't even his responsibility. This was what family was supposed to feel like. "Thank you," she whispered, the words completely inadequate for what she was feeling. Sam nodded once, then surprised her by reaching out to touch her cheek gently, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go," he said quietly. "Not while I have breath in my body." And in that moment, standing in the warm kitchen of a man who had chosen to make them his family without asking for anything in return, Eliza finally understood what it meant to be home. The transformation happened so gradually that Eliza almost missed it. The way the children stopped referring to the ranch as Mr. Hayes's place and started calling it home. The way Tommy began anticipating Sam's needs without being asked, appearing with tools or offering help before Sam even realized he needed it. The way the younger children stopped flinching when Sam's voice rose to call across the yard, having learned that his shouts were directions, not anger. Most telling of all was the way Baby Rose had begun reaching for Sam whenever he entered a room, her small arms extending toward him with the absolute trust that only children possess. Sam, for his part, had taken to carrying her around the ranch while he did his morning chores, pointing out animals and explaining what he was doing in the patient tone of someone who genuinely believed that a 3-year-old's questions mattered. "See those horses, Rosie?" he would say, lifting her so she could peer over the fence rail. "That big brown one is Justice. He's been my partner for going on 6 years now. And the pretty mare there, that's Bella. She's going to have a baby horse come spring." Rose would clap her hands and babble responses in the serious tone of someone participating in very important conversation, and Sam would nod gravely as if her words made perfect sense. Watching these interactions made Eliza's chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. Gratitude certainly for the way Sam had embraced not just her, but all of her siblings. But there was something else there too, something that felt dangerously close to love, though she was afraid to examine that feeling too closely. The morning everything changed started like any other. Eliza was in the kitchen making breakfast, while Sam was outside doing his morning rounds. The children were gradually waking up, the younger ones still rubbing sleep from their eyes as they shuffled toward the warmth of the fire. It was Lucy who first noticed the riders approaching. "Liza," she said, her voice tight with the old fear, "there's people coming." Eliza's blood immediately chilled, but when she looked out the window, these weren't the official riders she had been dreading. Instead, she saw a small group of women from Red Valley, led by Mrs. Patterson from the general store, and including several ladies she recognized from church. Her first instinct was to hide, to gather the children and disappear until the visitors left. But before she could act on that impulse, Sam appeared from the barn and walked toward the approaching group with his characteristic calm confidence. "Mrs. Patterson," she heard him say as he touched his hat brim politely. "Ladies, what brings you out to my place this fine morning?" Mrs. Patterson, a thin woman with graying hair and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to getting straight to the point, dismounted from her wagon with the help of one of the other women. "Samuel Hayes," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "There's been talk." "There always is," Sam replied mildly. Question is whether it's worth listening to. Talk about you harboring children that don't belong to you. Children that ought to be in proper care, with proper families. Eliza's heart clenched, but Sam's voice remained steady. Children that were sleeping rough and going hungry while proper families looked the other way, you mean? Mrs. Patterson had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. That's not the point, Samuel. Point is, you're a single man with no wife, no experience raising children. It's not appropriate. Appropriate, Sam repeated, and there was an edge to his voice now that made Eliza shiver. Tell me, Mrs. Patterson, what's appropriate about letting babies catch pneumonia while adults argue about propriety? Another woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. Samuel, we're not trying to make trouble. We're concerned about the children and about you. This situation, it can't continue as it is. Eliza found herself moving toward the door without conscious decision, drawn by something in the tone of the conversation that suggested this was more than simple neighborhood concern. She opened the door just enough to hear clearly. And what exactly do you propose should happen? Sam was asking. There is an orphanage in San Antonio, Mrs. Patterson said. Good Christian place. They take the children, see they get proper schooling, proper moral guidance. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. San Antonio was 100 miles away. An orphanage meant separation. She was too old, the children too scattered in age. They would be split up, placed in different homes or different institutions, and she would lose every single person she had fought so hard to protect. She pushed through the door before she could stop herself, stepping onto the porch with her chin raised and her hands clenched into fists. No, she said, her voice ringing across the yard with a strength that surprised even her. Absolutely not. The women turned toward her, their expressions ranging from sympathy to disapproval. Mrs. Patterson looked her up and down, taking in her simple dress, her work-roughened hands, her too-thin frame. Child, she said, not unkindly, you're barely more than a baby yourself. You can't possibly— I'm 19 years old, Eliza interrupted, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. I've kept these children alive for weeks on my own, kept them fed and safe and together when everyone else gave up on them. Don't you dare tell me what I can't possibly do. But you can't keep living here, Mrs. Henderson protested. It's not proper. You're not married, Mr. Hayes isn't family. Then I'll marry him. The words were out of Eliza's mouth before she had consciously decided to say them, hanging in the morning air like a challenge thrown down. She heard Sam's sharp intake of breath, saw the shocked expressions on the women's faces, felt her own heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't take the words back. Eliza, Sam said quietly, but she was beyond hearing caution now. I'll marry him, she repeated, her voice growing stronger. Today, if necessary. Then we'll be a proper family, and you can take your concerns and your orphanages and find somewhere else to apply them. Mrs. Patterson looked like she had been slapped. Young lady, marriage is not something to be entered into lightly as a solution to social problems. Marriage is what makes a family, Eliza said, her eyes blazing. And these children are my family, all of them, including Mr. Hayes, who has shown us more care and kindness than anyone else in this entire county. She turned to look at Sam then, really look at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not shock, not protest, but something that looked almost like wonder. If you'll have us, she said quietly. The words meant for him alone despite their audience. Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze holding hers while the women watched in fascination and horror. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I'd be honored, he said simply. Mrs. Patterson made a sound of exasperation. This is ridiculous. You can't just decide to get married because it's convenient. Can't we? Sam asked, his attention shifting back to the women. Last I checked, love and family weren't subject to committee approval. Love, Mrs. Henderson repeated, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. Love, Sam confirmed, his eyes finding Eliza's again. For her, for those children, for the life we've been building here. If that's not enough reason to get married, I don't know what is. Eliza felt her heart stop, then start again with a rhythm that seemed entirely new. He loved her. This good, kind, strong man loved her, and he was willing to say so in front of half the town gossips to protect her family. There's still the matter of a license, Mrs. Patterson said weakly, as if grasping for any remaining obstacle. Judge Morrison's in town through Friday, Sam replied calmly. I'm sure he'd be happy to perform the ceremony and file the paperwork. And the children? Will be legally mine once Eliza becomes my wife. Problem solved. The women exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they had been outmaneuvered, but unsure how to gracefully retreat. Well, Mrs. Patterson said finally, I suppose if you're determined to go through with this rash decision. We are, Eliza said firmly, reaching for Sam's hand and finding it warm and steady in hers. Then I suppose there's nothing more to be said. Mrs. Patterson gathered her dignity around her like a cloak and climbed back into her wagon. We'll expect to see you both in church next Sunday, as husband and wife. As the women drove away, leaving clouds of dust in the echo of their disapproval, Eliza suddenly realized what she had done. She had just proposed marriage to a man she had known for less than a month, in front of witnesses, with her entire family's future hanging in the balance, and she had meant every word. Eliza, Sam said quietly, his hand still warm in hers. I know what you're going to say, she interrupted, her voice rushing. I know it was presumptuous and sudden and probably crazy, but I meant it, Sam, not just because it solves our problem, but because, she took a shaky breath, because I love you too. Sam's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite gentleness. Then I guess we better go talk to Judge Morrison, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Wouldn't want to keep our family waiting. Behind them, the door creaked open and 6 children spilled onto the porch, their faces bright with excitement and hope. Are we really going to be Hayes? Lucy asked, bouncing on her toes. Are you really going to marry Mr. Sam? Mary added, her eyes shining. Eliza looked around at the faces of her siblings, her children really in all the ways that mattered, and then at the man who had chosen to love them all. Yes, she said, her voice full of certainty and joy. We're going to be a real family. And for the first time in her 19 years, Eliza Cole truly believed that happy endings were possible. The news of Sam and Eliza's engagement spread through Red Valley faster than wildfire in dry grass. By noon the same day, Mrs. Patterson and her committee had visited the ranch. It seemed like every person in town had heard about the sudden romance between the quiet rancher and the girl who had appeared from nowhere with 6 children in tow. The reactions were as varied as the people themselves. Some, like Doc Matthews and his wife Sarah, were openly supportive. About time Sam found himself someone, Doc had declared loudly in the general store. Man wasn't meant to live alone, and those children need stability. Good match all around. Others, particularly among the more established families in town, were scandalized by the speed and circumstances of the engagement. Barely knows the girl, Mrs. Caldwell had sniffed to anyone who would listen. And all those children, how can he possibly know what he's taking on? But it was the third group that worried Eliza the most, the ones who whispered about the Cole name, about Frank's debts and Margaret's bitter tongue, about whether bad blood might run true in the children. Eliza learned about this particular concern when she made her first trip into town since the engagement, bringing Mary and Beth with her to pick up supplies for the wedding. The moment they entered Patterson's general store, the conversation among the women gathered near the counter died abruptly. Miss Cole, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carefully neutral, or should I say, Miss Hayes-to-be. What can I help you with today? Just need some fabric for a dress, Eliza replied, her chin rising instinctively at the woman's tone. Something simple but nice. For the wedding, I assume? Asked Mrs. Wilkins, the banker's wife, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How lovely. Though I must say, it's all happening rather quickly, isn't it? Love doesn't keep a schedule, Eliza replied evenly, though her hands clenched slightly at her sides. Love, Mrs. Wilkins repeated, as if the word left a bad taste in her mouth. Yes, well, I suppose that's one way to put it. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Eliza felt Mary press closer to her side, and Beth's small hand slipped into hers. Even the children could sense the hostility in the room. Is there something you'd like to say directly, Mrs. Wilkins? Eliza asked, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Mrs. Wilkins smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. Oh, nothing direct, dear. It's just that some of us remember your father quite well. His, habits, his debts, the way he left town owing money to half the businesses here. I am not my father, Eliza said quietly. Of course not, Mrs. Wilkins agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. Still, one does wonder about influence, about what children learn from the examples they're given. The accusation hit Eliza like a slap. These women were questioning not just her worthiness to marry Sam, but her fitness to raise her siblings. They were suggesting that the Cole name carried some kind of moral contamination that would somehow infect Sam's life and reputation. My siblings and I have never stolen a penny or told a lie to get what we needed, Eliza said, her voice rising slightly. We've worked for everything we have, asked for nothing but the chance to prove ourselves. If that's not good enough for you, then I suggest you take up your concerns with Mr. Hayes directly. Before anyone could respond, the store's bell jingled and Sam himself walked through the door, as if summoned by her words. He took in the scene quickly, Eliza standing rigid with anger, the children pressed close to her sides, the circle of women watching with expressions that ranged from guilty to defiant. Afternoon, lady, he said pleasantly, but there was something in his voice that made everyone in the store go very still. Eliza, did you find what you were looking for? Still deciding, Eliza replied, her voice carefully controlled. Sam moved to stand beside her, his presence somehow making the room feel smaller and more charged. Anything I can help with? I know a thing or two about what looks good on a beautiful woman. The casual endearment, spoken in front of the town gossips, sent a clear message about where Sam's loyalties lay. Mrs. Wilkins's mouth pinched tight. Samuel, she said, her voice taking on a tone of false concern, I hope you know what you're doing. Taking on such a large family, well, it's a big responsibility. And given the children's background, their background, Sam repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Well, yes, their father's reputation, the way they were raised. One does worry about the influences they might bring to your home. Sam was silent for a long moment, and Eliza could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Mrs. Wilkin, he said, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. Are you suggesting that children who have suffered abandonment and hardship are somehow morally inferior to those who haven't? I'm not suggesting anything of the sort, Mrs. Wilkins protested, though her cheeks had gone red. I'm simply saying, you're saying that a 3-year-old baby is responsible for her father's debts, Sam continued relentlessly. That a boy who splits firewood from dawn to dusk is somehow tainted by blood he didn't choose. That a young woman who has sacrificed everything to keep her family together is unworthy of respect because of a name she's about to change. The store had gone completely silent. Even Mrs. Patterson had stopped pretending to organize merchandise and was staring openly at the confrontation. That's not what I meant, Mrs. Wilkins said weakly. Then what did you mean? Sam asked. Because I'm having trouble understanding how anyone could look at these children, who have shown more courage and loyalty and plain human decency than most adults I know, and see anything but a blessing. Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, not from hurt, but from pure gratitude. Sam wasn't just defending her, he was defending all of them, with a fierce protectiveness that left no room for doubt about where he stood. The Cole name ends with this generation, Sam continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the store. Come Saturday, they'll be Hayes's, my family, under my protection, and anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to discuss it with me personally. With that, he turned to Eliza and offered her his arm. Shall we go look at fabric? I think blue would suit you beautifully. They left the store in ringing silence, the children trailing behind them like ducklings following their parents. It wasn't until they were safely outside that Eliza realized she was shaking. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did, Sam replied firmly. Nobody talks about my family that way. Not now, not ever. My family. The words sent warmth flooding through her chest, washing away the lingering sting of Mrs. Wilkins's accusations. But even as they walked toward the wagon, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Changing their name wouldn't change some people's minds about who they were or where they came from. There would be other confrontations, other challenges to face. The difference was now they wouldn't face them alone. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, all 8 of them, because Sam had insisted that was how families ate their meals, Tommy brought up what they had all been thinking. "People in town don't like us much," he said bluntly, cutting straight to the heart of the matter in the way that teenagers did. "Some people," Sam corrected. "Others are fine with you. Doc Matthews asked me today if I thought you might be interested in helping him with his horses after school. Says you've got a good way with animals." Tommy's eyes lit up at that, but his expression remained troubled. "What about the ones who aren't fine with us? What happens when they decide they don't want the Cole children in their town?" It was Mary who answered, her young voice carrying a wisdom that shouldn't have belonged to a 13-year-old. "Then we show them we're not the Cole children anymore," she said simply. "We're the Hayes children, and Hayes children don't run from anything." Sam smiled at that, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "That's right. And Hayes children stick together, no matter what anyone else thinks." "Hayes children," Lucy repeated, testing the words like she was tasting something sweet. "I like how that sounds." "So do I," Eliza said softly, reaching for Sam's hand across the table. "So do I." But as the evening wore on and the children gradually headed to bed, Eliza found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the lights of Red Valley in the distance. Somewhere out there, people were talking about them, making judgments, deciding whether 7 abandoned children and the man who had chosen to love them deserved to be accepted into the community. She felt Sam's arms slide around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Worried?" he asked quietly. "Some," she admitted. "People have long memories for grudges, and the Cole name will be history in 3 days," Sam finished firmly. "What matters isn't what people remember about Frank and Margaret. What matters is what they learn about us." Eliza leaned back against his solid warmth, drawing strength from his certainty. "And what will they learn? That the Hayes family takes care of each other, that we work hard, keep our word, and don't back down from what's right." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And that love is stronger than gossip, always." In the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the moon, but inside the warm kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of family, children's laughter echoing from the bedrooms, the smell of home-baked bread, the strong arms of a good man, Eliza finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. No matter what the town thought, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had this. They had each other. And sometimes that was enough to change the world. The night before their wedding, Eliza found herself unable to sleep. She stood at the bedroom window, the room that would officially become theirs tomorrow, watching the stars wheel overhead and trying to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. In less than 12 hours, she would be Mrs. Samuel Hayes, and 7 orphan children would officially become a family. It should have been the happiest night of her life. Instead, she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something vast and unknown. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Eliza, you awake?" Sam's voice, quiet and careful in deference to the sleeping children. "Come in," she whispered back. He entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising like small prayers in the cool air. He handed her one and moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not quite touching. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Been thinking," he admitted, "about tomorrow, about what it means." Eliza's heart clenched. "Having second thoughts? About marrying you? Never." His voice was firm, certain. "About whether I'm the right man to be a father to 6 children I barely know? That's a different question." The honesty in his voice made her turn to look at him. In the moonlight, his profile was strong and serious, the face of a man grappling with the weight of responsibility he was choosing to take on. "You don't have to be perfect," she said softly. "None of us expect that." "Don't you?" He looked at her then, his eyes searching. "Eliza, those children have been through hell. They've been abandoned, left hungry, forced to survive on scraps and hope. They need someone who can give them stability, security, Love. What if I fail them? The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in her chest. This strong, capable man who had faced down hostile townspeople and taken on 7 strangers without hesitation was afraid. Afraid of not being enough, of letting down people who had already been let down too many times. Sam, she said, setting down her coffee and turning to face him fully, do you want to know what those children see when they look at you? He waited, his eyes intent on her face. They see the man who gave Rose medicine when she was sick and didn't ask for anything in return. They see the man who taught Danny how to whistle and showed Beth how to braid a rope. They see the man who stood up to half the town to defend our right to be here. She reached for his hands, found them warm and slightly rough from work. They see the man who looked at 7 strangers and saw family. But what if that's not enough? What if I make mistakes, say the wrong thing, can't give them what they need? Then you'll figure it out, same as I did, Eliza replied. You think I knew what I was doing when our parents left? You think I had some grand plan for keeping 6 children alive and together? I was terrified every single day. I made mistakes constantly. But I loved them, and I never gave up, and somehow that was enough. Sam was quiet for a moment, his thumbs tracing patterns on her knuckles. Is that what you think love is? Not giving up? Part of it, Eliza said. Love is showing up day after day, even when it's hard. It's putting someone else's needs before your own, not because you have to, but because you want to. It's seeing the best in people even when they can't see it in themselves. Like you did with me, Sam said quietly. What do you mean? You saw something in me worth loving, worth building a life with. I'm not sure I see it myself most days. Eliza felt her heart squeeze tight at his words. Sam Hayes, you are the best man I have ever known. You're kind and strong and generous, and I'm just a rancher, Eliza. I milk cows and mend fences and read books by myself most evenings. I'm not exciting or worldly or... She silenced him the only way she could think of, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when his arms came around her and pulled her closer, it deepened into something that spoke of promises and possibilities and a future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sam rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said, the words rough with emotion. I love your strength and your fierce protectiveness and the way you make this house feel like home. I love how you sing while you cook and how you braid Rose's hair every morning. I love that you stood up to those women in town and told them exactly what you thought. I love you too, Eliza whispered back. I love your patience and your gentleness and the way you never make me feel like a burden. I love how you listen to Tommy like his opinions matter and how you carry Rose around like she's made of spun glass. I love that you chose us when you could have chosen solitude. They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other in the quiet certainty of what they had found together. Tomorrow would bring challenges, it always did. But tonight there was just this, 2 people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to face whatever came next. Are you nervous? Sam asked eventually. About tomorrow? About the ceremony? No. Eliza pulled back to look at him. About starting a life with you? A little, but it's a good kind of nervous, like standing at the edge of something wonderful. The children are excited, Sam said, smiling slightly. Rose keeps asking if she gets to throw flowers. Lucy wants to know if she can wear her best dress. Tommy's been practicing what he's going to say when Judge Morrison asks if anyone objects. What's he going to say? That anyone who objects to this marriage will have to go through him first. Sam's smile widened. Kid's got a protective streak a mile wide when it comes to his family. His family, Eliza repeated, warmth flooding her chest at the words. I still can't quite believe it's real sometimes, that we're really going to be a family. We already are a family, Sam said firmly. Tomorrow just makes it official. A door creaked down the hall, followed by the soft pad of bare feet. A moment later, Rose appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and clutching her ragged doll. Liza, why aren't you sleeping? Just talking with Mr. Sam, sweetheart, Eliza said, moving to scoop up her baby sister. What are you doing awake? Had a dream, Rose said, nestling against Eliza's shoulder. About the pretty dress and flowers. The wedding dress? Sam asked gently, reaching out to smooth Rose's tangled hair. Rose nodded solemnly. Liza looked like a princess, and we all had new names. Hayes, Eliza said softly. Rose Hayes. How does that sound? Good, Rose said with the certainty that only small children possessed. It sounds like belonging. Sam and Eliza exchanged a look over Rose's head, both thinking the same thing. Sometimes children understood things better than adults ever could. Come on, little one, Sam said, extending his arms. Let's get you back to bed. Big day tomorrow. As he carried Rose back to her room, Eliza heard him humming softly, a lullaby his own mother had probably sung to him years ago. The sound filled something empty in her chest, the realization that her children would grow up with gentle songs and patient bedtime stories, with a father who understood that love was made of small, everyday moments. When Sam returned, they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sky begin to lighten at the edges with the promise of dawn. I should let you get some rest, Sam said finally. Big day ahead. Sam? Eliza caught his hand as he turned to go. Thank you for all of this, for choosing us. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Thank you for letting me. After he left, Eliza finally crawled into bed, but sleep still eluded her. Instead, she lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought them here. From that dusty road where her parents had abandoned them, through hunger and cold and fear, to this warm room where tomorrow she would wake up as someone's wife, someone's partner, someone's choice. It seemed impossible that so much could change in so little time. But then again, the best things in life often happened when you least expected them, in the quiet moments when hope had almost died, but somehow found the strength to take one more breath. Outside her window, the first birds began their morning songs, and Eliza smiled as she finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of white dresses and new names and a future that stretched out before them like a promise finally kept. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Hayes Ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to herald something special. Eliza woke to the sound of excited whispers in the hallway and the smell of bacon cooking in the kitchen. Sam, she realized, making breakfast for the family on what would be their last morning as simply housemates rather than husband and wife. The children were already up and bustling around when she emerged from her room, their faces bright with excitement and anticipation. Mary and Beth had laid out their best dresses, simple but clean, with ribbons in their hair that Lucy had insisted on braiding for them. Tommy wore his only good shirt, pressed carefully and tucked into pants that were almost too short, but would have to do. Danny had attempted to slick down his unruly hair with water, though several cowlicks were already beginning to rebel. And Rose, sweet baby Rose, was wearing a tiny yellow dress that Mrs. Henderson had quietly delivered the day before. A wedding gift, the note had said, for the littlest Hayes. You look beautiful, Eliza told them all, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. Not as beautiful as you're going to look, Mary said, bouncing on her toes. Wait until you see what we found. She and Beth led Eliza back to the bedroom, where hanging from the wardrobe door was a dress she had never seen before. It was simple but elegant, made of pale blue fabric with tiny pearl buttons down the front and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It was clearly new and clearly expensive, far beyond anything she could have afforded. Where did this come from? Eliza breathed, running her fingers over the soft fabric. Mr. Sam, Beth said, grinning. He rode into town early yesterday and talked to Mrs. Morrison about getting it made special. She worked all night to finish it in time. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. While she had been worrying about wearing her one good dress, patched and faded from years of use, Sam had been quietly arranging for her to have something beautiful for their wedding day. He said, Mary added importantly, that every bride deserves to feel like a princess on her wedding day. An hour later, dressed in the beautiful blue gown, with her hair carefully pinned up and roses from Sam's garden tucked behind her ear, Eliza stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized herself. She looked happy, she realized. For the first time in years, she looked truly, completely happy. The ceremony itself was held in the main room of the cabin, with Judge Morrison officiating and what seemed like half the town in attendance. Doc Matthews and his wife had come, along with several of the families who had shown kindness to the children. Even Mrs. Patterson was there, though she sat in the back and maintained an expression of polite skepticism. Sam stood waiting for her near the fireplace, wearing a dark suit she had never seen before, and an expression of wonder that made her heart skip. When their eyes met across the room, he smiled, slow and warm and full of promise, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was right. All of it. The hasty engagement, the practical considerations, the 7 children who would officially become their family in the next few minutes. All of it was exactly as it should be. Judge Morrison kept the ceremony simple and brief, perhaps understanding that the real vows had already been exchanged in quiet moments and everyday choices over the past weeks. When Sam slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another surprise, another thoughtful gesture that made her love him even more, and promised to cherish and protect her and their children for as long as he lived. Eliza felt something settle into place in her chest that she hadn't realized was missing. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Morrison announced, and Sam cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, while their children cheered and the assembled guests applauded. Mrs. Samuel Hayes. The name sang in her head like a song she had been waiting her whole life to hear. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Mrs. Matthews had brought a cake, small but beautifully decorated with sugar flowers. Doc Matthews produced a fiddle from somewhere and played wedding music while the children danced and laughed. Even some of the more skeptical neighbors seemed to be won over by the obvious happiness of the new family. But the moment that would stay with Eliza forever came near the end of the evening, when little Rose tugged on Sam's coat sleeve and looked up at him with serious brown eyes. "Papa Sam," she said, trying out the name they had all agreed she could use, "are we really your family now? Forever and always?" Sam knelt down to her level, his face soft with love and certainty. "Forever and always, little one. You're stuck with me now." Rose threw her arms around his neck with a giggle, and Eliza felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst from pure happiness. As the last guest departed and the children were tucked into bed, all of them too excited to sleep but pretending for the sake of adult expectations, Sam and Eliza found themselves alone in their kitchen for the first time as husband and wife. "So," Sam said, hanging up his coat and rolling up his sleeves, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Hayes?" "Like coming home," Eliza replied without hesitation. "Like finding the place I was always meant to be." Sam smiled and pulled her into his arms, swaying gently, even though there was no music. "Think we can make this work? 7 children, 1 ranch, 2 people who are still figuring out how to be married?" "I think," Eliza said, standing on her toes to kiss him softly, "that we already are making it work. The rest is just details." Outside, the Texas wind whispered through the oak trees and carried the promise of seasons to come. Winters to weather together, springs to plant new hopes, summers to watch their children grow strong and happy under the vast sky. There would be challenges, certainly. There would be difficult days and moments of doubt and times when love alone wouldn't feel like enough. But tonight, in the warm circle of Sam's arms, with 6 sleeping children safe under their roof, and a future stretching out before them like an open road, Eliza Hayes knew that they had everything they needed to face whatever came next. They had each other. They had family. They had love that had been chosen rather than simply given, tested by hardship and proven true. And sometimes that was more than enough. Sometimes that was everything. And so, in a time when family was often determined by blood alone, 7 abandoned children and 1 lonely rancher discovered that the strongest families are built not on obligation, but on choice. Not on shared names, but on shared hearts. Not on what you're born with, but on what you're willing to fight for. Eliza Cole became Eliza Hayes, not just in name, but in spirit, finding in Sam the partner she had never dared to dream of, and giving him in return a ready-made family that filled his quiet house with laughter and love. Tommy grew into a fine young man under Sam's guidance, eventually taking over much of the ranch work and proving that a boy's character isn't determined by his father's failures. Mary, Beth, Lucy, and Danny each found their own paths to happiness, secure in the knowledge that they belonged somewhere, that they were wanted and valued and loved. And little Rose, She grew up believing that Papa Sam had always been her father, that the Hayes Ranch had always been her home, that families were supposed to choose each other with open hearts and stubborn loyalty. The people of Red Valley eventually came around, as people often do when faced with the undeniable evidence of genuine love and happiness. The Hayes family became pillars of their community, Sam serving on the school board, Eliza teaching Sunday school, the children growing into adults who understood that kindness was a choice worth making every single day. Because that's what this story is really about. The radical idea that love is stronger than circumstance, that family is what you make it, and that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come from the most desperate endings. What did you think of Eliza and Sam's incredible journey from strangers to soulmates? Have you ever experienced or witnessed the kind of chosen family that transcends blood relations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing how these stories of frontier love and resilience touch your hearts. If this tale of 7 abandoned children finding their forever home made you believe in the power of love to transform lives, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage, family, and the unbreakable bonds that make us human. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just restore your faith in happy endings. And remember, in a world that often tells us we're defined by where we come from, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose where we belong.